Good evening and welcome to Crawley Borough Council's Overview Scrutiny Commission meeting of the 11th of March 2024. I am Councillor Marion Ayling, Chair of the Overview Scrutiny Commission. This meeting is being live streamed by the Council's YouTube channel as a trial. Please note that there is no comment function available on YouTube. You should be aware that the Council is the data controller under the Data Protection Act. Data collected during the webcast will be retained in accordance with the Council's published retained policy. Any members of the public seated in the public gallery may be filmed by the automated camera system. Your image may be captured. Therefore, by entering the meeting room, you are consenting to being filmed and to the possible use of these images and sound recordings for webcasting and training purposes. Councillors are reminded to take note that what is displayed on the screen in the room as these show what is being recorded. Please can councillors remain seated when speaking, as the cameras are currently set to capture seated positions. Please do not move the microphones too close to you. You can request to speak as usual in committees by raising your hand, to speak by pressing the button with the face on it, and the microphone will go green when you are live. For those in the building, there are no scheduled fire drills tonight, so if the event of a fire alarm activation, please leave the building. The main route is via the spiral staircase through the main entrance doors. Should this route not be accessible, the secondary route is via the main spiral staircase across the contact centre and through the doors. Once outside, make your way to the fire assembly point located beyond the multi-storey car park entrance on Exchange Road. If you're unable to use the stairs, then please wait in the chamber and you will be guided by a member of staff to the evacuation lift. I would like to request all mobile phones to be put on silent and put away, and can everyone please talk into the microphones. The agenda papers for this meeting are available on the Council's website, and we will now commence with apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chair. Received apologies of absence from Councillor Pennington.
Does any members have any disclosure of interest or whipping declarations? Councillor Lanza.
Thank you, Chair. Item 8, the Health and Adult Social Care Scrutiny Committee, as a member of West Sussex County Council and Cabinet Member for Public Health and Wellbeing. Thank you.
Thank you. Minutes. Now we come to the minutes of the last meeting that was held on the 29th of January 2024. Does the Commission agree that the minutes are an accurate record of the meeting? Agreed? Agreed. Thank you. We have no public in attendance, so we will move on. We will start with item 5. We will start with the second home council tax premiums report from Councillor Nawaz, Deputy Leader of the Council, and Caroline Martlew, Head of Corporate Finance. Councillor Jones sends his apologies for tonight. Councillor Nawaz, will you now introduce your report, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm here to obviously deputise Councillor Jones, who's not able to come today. As we're all aware, the Council declared a housing emergency on 21st of February 2024. This report recommends the introduction of council tax premiums on long-term empty properties on second homes. The wider aim of the report is to reduce the number of empty homes and to encourage the use of properties as main residence rather than as second homes in the borough. It is therefore proposed to introduce a 100% premium on empty homes after 1 year instead of 2 years, and to also introduce a second home premium of 100% both with effect from 1st of April 2025. Officers have put their reasons for the recommendation as well in the report, and any information, any question from the Commission, we are happy to answer that on those. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Nawaz, for bringing this forward. I mean, I think the measures introduced by the government are, in my view, perfectly welcome in this case. We should be doing more to we are in a housing crisis, and we do need to make use of the existing housing stock we've got where required, and also we are in a tight spot financially. So I think this ticks both goals quite well. So I welcome it being brought forward, and I will be fully supporting it. I guess my only question is around the second homes provision, and whether we'll see more people try and sort of hide around it. Maybe if they're in a family unit, they'll put one family member in one house and another family member in another house. I just wonder what are the, and I'm personally unaware, although I probably should be aware, what are the penalties for trying to defraud the council or councils and sort of make false submissions when it comes to council tax? And I realise this might not be your area of speciality either, so please feel free to pass it on to a relevant officer if they're aware.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Yes, like in many areas, like council tax, there will be attempted fraud, such as claims that properties have been let to other family members, etc. We do currently undertake visits to check on properties, and have other means such as credit searches and other information like refuse collection and missed bins. So yeah, we do check up, but people do try, yes. And of course we have a fraud team.
If I could just, thank you very much for that. I mean, I would also say, obviously, I don't think, Crawley is not necessarily a hub of holiday homes. I don't think the sort of the empty homes is necessarily going to bring in a huge amount of revenue as highlighted. But every little can help, and it's spreading the message. So I welcome it overall, even though it might not make a big difference in Crawley. Thank you.
Sorry. Right, okay. All committee members have had the opportunity to speak, so we will move on to the recommendation. I move that the Commission notes the report and requests that the views expressed during the debate be fed back to the Cabinet through the Commission's comment sheet, and ask for the Vice Chair to second, please.
Yes, I'll second that.
Thank you. Recommendations are agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Item 6. We will move on to the Climate Emergency Action Plan update from Clem Smith, Head of Economy and Planning, along with Phil Morris, Sustainability Officer, and Councillor Bob Noyce is also in attendance as the Cabinet Member for Environment, Sustainability and Climate Change. As a reminder, this is an update item for the Commission only and won't be going to Cabinet. Please can I ask you to provide an update? Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. I'm just going to give an overview and then pass it on to Phil Morris to do the presentation, which I think is a very interesting one. Crawley Borough Council declared a climate emergency in 2019, and we made a commitment to reduce our carbon emissions by at least 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2040 at the latest. We established a scrutiny panel to explore how we can reduce our impact on the climate, and they met through 2020 and into 2021, resulting in an action plan which was formally adopted by Cabinet in autumn 2021. We're here this evening to review the implementation of that action plan and the impact it has had. Our working environment has changed significantly since 2019. COVID showed that hybrid work was possible. The war in Ukraine increased the cost of energy, and a rise in the demand for temporary accommodation has impacted local authority budgets around the country, with Crawley very badly affected. Our understanding of climate change and how we can respond has also advanced over the last 5 years. As you are about to hear, we've made significant progress in identifying pathways to net zero, but we are also clearer about the challenges and where we are dependent on government, the national electricity grid and others. We cannot do this alone. According to the carbon literacy course, local authorities are directly responsible for around 2% of carbon emissions, but we have influence over about 30%. We need to urgently implement what we have learnt over the last 5 years and work in partnership with local residents and businesses to make Crawley a cleaner and healthier place with a sustainable future. Thank you.
Good evening, thank you. Just to give you a quick reminder of the Climate Emergency Action Plan. It comprises of 7 sections. The first are overarching cross-cutting issues, followed by sections around energy use, renewable energy and storage, low carbon transport, waste and water, procurement, and green and blue infrastructure. What I'm going to plan to do this evening is give you a high-level view of how we are performing against those high-level priority areas, and then talk a little bit about the current pathways that we have towards net zero, how we are, progressing in the implementation of the action plan. And then I'm going to follow up with proposals for changing the action plan under the recommendation of the Climate Emergency Board. So starting with the actions, the overarching actions, there are 14 cross-cutting actions which relate to the overall delivery of the climate commitments. A lot of these have been positively completed, such as the design and adoption of the action plan and the establishment of a climate emergency board. We're still in the process of establishing monitoring and decision-making tools and working to embed them in council practice. And I'll come on to that in a bit more detail later. We've started to prepare for the introduction of a climate awareness training and expect to be rolling out carbon literacy training for key officers and members in the coming year. One of the significant areas of challenge, as Councillor Noyce has already mentioned, is around finance. And we urgently need to identify new sources of capital funding to be able to deliver some of the projects that will enable us to reduce our emissions. Use of energy is a very significant area, and the actions under these sections comprise nearly half of the action plan. Progress has been, a lot of positive progress has been made. I'm sure you'll be aware of phase 1 of the district heat network being completed, and phase 2 decisions around that are imminent. We have completed audits of almost all of our building stock, and we have energy performance certificates for almost all of our estate. And we've also made significant improvements in the use of cloud-based computing. And efficient devices have been rolled out through the town hall here, which have led to a significant reduction in the use of energy across the council. We've also nearly successfully introduced a new local plan, and this has got a lot of very strong elements around sustainable development criteria in it, and that's a very solid platform for ongoing improvements in efficiency right across the borough. Work in progress includes the complete phasing out of gas boilers, which will be partly dependent on national legislation, but also making the embedding of retrofit, so improving the efficiency of existing buildings and making sure that's fully aligned with planned maintenance so that it can be done at the lowest possible cost. Transport and procurement is another very significant part of the action plan. And as we mentioned a moment ago, hybrid working is something that's been very changed hugely over the last 3 years, which has reduced energy consumption in council offices and staff travel. The rolling out of the electric vehicle charging strategy is underway, but we're being slowed here by partly by finance, the cost of new vehicles, but also because of the capacity of the local electrical grid to enable us to charge vehicles. So that is still work in progress. We've produced a staff travel plan, but further action is needed to reduce the amount of staff commuting by car. Supply chains emissions are a very significant issue for us. I'll come on to this in a little bit more detail later, but right across industry, they're very hard to measure. So this is the emissions associated with the procured goods and services. So it'd be the emissions associated with the building that we're in, the equipment that we're using. Because we have a large number of suppliers, some of whom are tracking their own emissions, but many are not, it's very difficult to get an accurate picture of supply chain emissions. We're looking to improve our understanding of those emissions through updating the Social Value Charter later this year. In terms of waste and green infrastructure, we've seen good introduction of new working practices in our parks and gardens, which have reduced the amount of energy required, reducing water consumption, and also reducing chemicals. Where we are facing some delays is around the introduction of changes to our waste collection. The government waste collection strategy is due for implementation next year, and we're expecting that will increase recycling rates and reduce waste. One of the areas where we had hoped to introduce new electric vehicles was in the refuse collection fleet, but we weren't able to do that because of the cost of procuring the new electric vehicles, but also because there wasn't sufficient grid capacity to enable those vehicles to be charged. So as a result, we've purchased a new diesel fleet, but we're investigating hydrogenated vegetable oil as an alternative fuel, which will also result in significantly reduced emissions. So I've given you a very quick run through of the action plan, but now I want to give you a little bit of an update of really show you the impact that those actions are having. Before I do that, I want to give you a quick reminder of the different categories of emissions. We typically talk about three main areas. The first is Scope 1, which is direct emissions from the use of gas, diesel, and petrol. And that is approximately 7% of our total emissions. Scope 2 is emissions from electricity, so the emissions associated with generating the electricity that we use. And Scope 3 is emissions from procured goods and services, which I mentioned a moment ago, and that comprises nearly 90% of our total emissions footprint. One thing to note is that Crawley Borough Council has made a commitment to reduce all of our emissions by 50% by 2030. Most UK local authorities have only made commitments around Scopes 1 and 2, even though many UK local authorities have made net zero 2030 commitments. They're actually less ambitious than what we're aiming to do, just to reduce all of our emissions by 50% by 2030. So if we look quickly at the emissions reduction trajectories that we're on, this is for our Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So it shows how they are reducing, or how they have reduced over the last 5 years. The orange line at the bottom is emissions from electricity usage, and you can see that has gone down quite significantly, mainly because of decarbonisation of the national grid. As we've moved away from coal and increased renewables have come on stream, the overall emissions associated with that electricity use has dropped. But we've also made improvements in efficiency that have helped that downward trajectory. The blue line is gas consumption, and you can see that has been largely static over the last 5 years. And if you look at the top line then, that's our total Scope 1 and 2 emissions, with the yellow dotted line showing a 50% reduction in 2030. So the trajectory of our current climate commitments. And the blue line showing the trajectory for a net zero 2030 trajectory. So if we just look at a little bit more detail then at where those emissions are coming from, you'll see that the pie chart on the left is showing 61% of our emissions come from the use of gas, 20% from electricity, and around 17% from diesel. And if we then explore where the gas is being used, we can see that around nearly 70% of that is being consumed at K2. And 5 main sites comprise nearly 90% of our gas consumption. So this is the information that we've been able to develop over the last 5 years through the implementation of the action plan, and we recognise that further data collection and analysis is needed to enable us to continue to reduce emissions. So the priorities that have come out of that analysis really suggest that heat decarbonisation plans are a critical critical requirement to enable us to unlock grant funding from the government, and this grant funding could provide up to 70% of the capital expenditure needed for electrification of heat across our estate. What we're looking to do this year is to develop heat decarbonisation plans at K2 and possibly at other sites. We expect that a complete electrification of heat at K2 would cost around £5 million. And of that, if grant funding is available, Crawley Borough Council would need to provide maybe up to £1.5 million. So the data that we've been able to develop through the action plan over the last 5 years has really given us a much clearer identification of the pathways to decarbonisation, but it has also identified that we cannot do this as alone, as Councillor Noyce said earlier. We are very dependent on grant funding from the government, and we're also dependent on grid capacity and the ongoing decarbonisation of the national grid. So with that in mind, the Climate Emergency Board have made some proposals to changes to the action plan, which we would like to investigate and develop over the next 6 months. The purpose of this will be to focus more on delivery. We've done a lot of the hard work now of increasing understanding of where our emissions are and how they can be reduced. But we need to now focus on making sure that the approaches to decarbonisation are fully embedded in service plans. An updated action plan would be focused on delivery with clear targeted objectives and with a link to service action plans, identifying what we need to do as a council, but also clearly identifying the assumptions and dependencies which are beyond our control. And what we propose is that we would bring a presentation back to OSC and Cabinet in the autumn. Just as an example of what the action plan, an updated action plan could look like, I'll show you a very high-level view of scopes 1, 2, and 3. And what we would expect is that for each of those specific areas of emissions, we would identify a new target. In this case, it'd be the example given is the 90% reduction. We would identify the main priorities that could lead that to be delivered on time, but also, very importantly, the assumptions and dependencies which are outside of our control. The example here is for electricity usage, and we think that there's an opportunity to reduce electricity consumption the emissions associated with electricity consumption reduce that by 50%. But at the same time, we will need to largely increase electricity consumption to enable the electrification of heat. And so if we're to achieve that target, we are very dependent on grid decarbonisation and grid capacity. So again, we'll be looking to set targets around scope 3 or supply chain emissions. And here our current commitment is to reduce that by 50% by 2030. While we identify this as a significant risk, we do feel that that's possible if we can start to embed decision-making around decarbonisation. We will also need supporting strategies, and we've listed 3 here that will be required. Communications and engagement, which we hope to introduce later this year. Sequestration and offsetting, so how we can identify ways in which residual emissions can be sequestered, and borough-wide emissions, how we will journey with residents and businesses across Crawley to help them with decarbonisation. So in conclusion then, we have made significant progress over the last 5 years, but we urgently need to focus on delivery to ensure that we can continue that trend for decarbonisation and meet those targets. The pathways, particularly for scope 1 and 2 emissions, are clear, but there are many external dependencies, and we need to make sure that we're working with central government and with other partners like the local electricity distribution organisations to enable that to happen. And we've identified scope 3 emissions as the greatest risk for our current climate commitments. I'll pause now and see if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I'll now open it to question and discussion. Do any councillors have any questions, please? Councillor Hillier.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for the overview. Just one question, really. It's just in relation, you mentioned about the finance challenge and reliance upon capital funding, and that you're reliant on, hopefully, which you haven't done yet, getting a 3.5 million grant. What impact will it make in terms of delivery and achieving the sort of end goal in terms of dates if you don't get that funding, and when do you estimate that funding for the grants will be received?
Thank you for the question. I think local authorities around the country are waiting for more clarity around funding for capital investment in net zero projects. What we can see is that another round of the public sector decarbonisation scheme has been announced for the autumn. We've not yet applied for that funding stream, but many other local authorities have. And the kind of project that we would be looking to put forward, the electrification of heat at K2, would be very appropriate for that funding stream. So we're fully aware that funding allocations from that stream tend to be fully allocated within hours of it being released, which is why it's very important that we invest up front in developing the heat decarbonisation plan, which will provide all the information needed to be able to put a successful application in. So we've got studies taking place at K2 in the next couple of months to produce all the information needed for that application. But we still need to, but for future rounds and for further investment, we need to identify where that money will come from. Thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned as part of the plan you'll be involved in communications and engagements. Presumably that is with residents in the borough. I wonder if you could give any more details on that.
Yes, it will. We already have quite a few existing channels of communication where we're regularly sharing messages around energy saving and decarbonisation. Just as examples, there are government grant funding streams, the Home Upgrade Grant and the Eco funding available for households facing fuel poverty. So what we'll be looking to do is to identify what existing channels of communication we have and what additional channels we need to develop in order to really help businesses and residents understand how to reduce their use of fossil fuels and improve efficiency. The first priority of a new strategy, which we haven't developed yet, so that is very much work in progress, will be around internal communication, so helping officers and members to understand what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it, before then sharing that more widely with businesses and residents.
Sorry, could I add a supplement on that? I mean, it does occur to me, and I was just trying to get some joined up thinking here, and Councillor Lanza and Councillor Piggott and myself were on the Waste and Recycling Committee. There may be some possibility of link-ups that we can actually have a broad communication that might go to our residents, on any changes that we have in waste collection and recycling, but also how we can assist people and encourage people to reduce energy consumption and decarbonise. So I think there is a possibility of a synergy there, and it may be something, if we can communicate on at a later date, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify on Scope 3 emissions, to check whether I was understanding this correctly. We don't currently have any criteria in place for, say, tendering or our procurement for limits that we want to see for people that we would want to be working with. But yet, I assume what you're saying is we're going to put that in place. But is that correct, or is it just that we don't have it in all areas?
We've got information from some suppliers, but it's not yet part of our procurement process to require that information. So that would be a big part of an updated procurement charter.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that would be really welcome, I think, because that would, ensure that we're working closely with like-minded sort of people, groups, organizations. Thank you. I just wanted to check.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation. It's fascinating, and I could probably ask you questions for the next hour, but I'll try and limit myself to the next 20 minutes. First of all, what I wanted to understand was, where do emissions from Crawley Homes residents sit? Because from what I could see, they didn't sit under Scope 1 or 2. Now, obviously, our Crawley Homes residents don't really have... They can control how much heating they use, but they can't go and change their boiler of their own accord. They can't go and put their own insulation in. And obviously, I would imagine, the roughly 10,000 local residents all with a boiler is going to obviously have quite a large carbon emission penalty. So I just wondered where they sat from a scoping perspective. And I've got some follow-ups, obviously, as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That is a good question. There are quite a few actions in our action plan that relate to efficiency improvements and the type of heating technologies that we use through Crawley Homes. But the emissions associated with the use of those through the use of those boilers and in those homes actually doesn't come under Crawley Borough Council's emissions. So they're considered as part of the broader borough-wide emissions and not directly part of our emissions. Where we might take responsibility for those emissions are in maybe shared areas, entrance hallways and heating and lighting of shared spaces. But for individual dwellings, we don't take responsibility for those.
Okay, thank you. Next question, following on from Councillor Russell's question. I think, but I could be wrong, that West Sussex has also declared a climate emergency. And I just wonder, when we're talking about communications with residents, you'd like to think we'd sort of work hand in hand with West Sussex on that kind of thing, because we're both, trying to get to the same goal, or they've got different, Scope 1 and 2 emissions relevancy. If we're talking about trying to get residents sort of, more educated, I'd like to think that'd fall under both of our remits. Have we worked with them much at all on the communication side of things?
Yes, there's quite good coordination between County Council and the districts and boroughs in West Sussex. So we're part of a sustainability communications working group. There was a meeting earlier today talking about some of the different communications channels and messaging that were already out there. But you're right, we do need to work very closely with them, and it's the development of our own strategy is still it's still very much work in progress. And so, understanding what are the existing channels of communication, what new channels do we need to develop, who do we work with, how can we share opportunities for messaging will be very much a part of that. Thank you.
Great, I've still got two more, sorry, but that's fantastic. Thank you for that answer. My third question is around grant funding that Councillor Hellier raised. There is the possibility, and I don't mean to dwell on this, but there is the possibility that government could change over the next 12 months. What impact does that have on our sort of confidence in grant schemes that we're applying for at the moment, that it won't considerably change under a new regime in Westminster?
I think one of the things that we're trying to do in proposing a new structure for the action plan is to identify what the dependencies and assumptions are. So what we would be looking to say is that we can decarbonise, we can reduce our reliance on gas if the funding is available. If the funding is not available, then we won't be able to proceed with that plan. But we can still work to improve the efficiency of our buildings. We can still work to install low energy lighting. We can reduce our reliance on fossil fuels as much as possible, and we would continue to do that through the regular maintenance programs anyway. But the significant investment in electrification of heating will only be able to happen if we can identify sources of grant funding and successfully apply for them.
Okay, thank you for that. And my last question is on the electrification of heat at K2, because that is obviously such a key part of our plans going forward. We talked about the capital, the possible capital cost, and obviously we haven't fleshed it out yet, so we'll get to that when we do. But I mean, there wasn't any mention at the time of the initial ongoing cost to the council. And then the second question, especially with regard to K2, is I don't know how the contract is structured. Are we on the hook for paying for the ongoing heating of the water, or is that actually part of the agreement with Freedom Leisure? And this might be a Part B discussion, so please feel free to flag me into Part B or not answer relevant bits. But I just wonder, is there a cost increases to it, or will there be a cost, saving to it? And what will that be, and who will benefit from it, and how will we cover that off in the contract with Freedom Leisure?
If you're happy for me to answer that, I think there's a lot that we don't know, and so first of all we do need to complete the heat decarbonisation plans, but I'll hand over.
So broad rule of thumb with K2, the day-to-day running costs fall to EA. So I need to check this, but I'm pretty sure that the bills will fall to them, but we retain responsibility for the capital and the maintenance and the upkeep of the capital. So it would be a consideration, I think, when we kind of go through it about the payoff, because it would be our investment, potentially their benefit, but we can get to that when we get to it.
Fantastic, thank you. First of all, I'd like to pass on my apologies for arriving late. Thank you very much. And apologies for coming in halfway through what it was obviously a very good presentation. I just have one very quick question. It relates to the sequestering of carbon. It sounds like there's lots of variability and flexibility needed. How important is sequestering of carbon going to be in that overall process, in general terms?
The honest answer is that we're still developing plans to understand that. We think that there is a way to reduce gas consumption by 90% or more, and if the national grid is able to get to net zero, then our actual residual emissions will be quite low. There is the thinking around carbon sequestration is still developing. We're working with colleagues at County Council and across the districts and boroughs to develop shared approaches to it. Tree planting is one of the most reliable ways of sequestering carbon, but we have fairly limited opportunities to plant more trees here in Crawley. Rooftop solar, rooftop generation of solar electricity is another opportunity. So that's one that we're exploring in more detail at the moment. But I think it'll take us another year or two to really understand and have a detailed strategy for how we can do that.
Can I just have a quick follow-on? Thank you. That's really interesting to hear. Do we feel that sequestration of carbon would be something we would employ if we saw shortfalls in other elements of the calculation, or is it really just once we've come to the nth process of reducing our carbon usage in terms of fossil fuels that we would then move into sequestering of carbon?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for credible decarbonisation, we really need to focus on reducing emissions first, but at the same time, be exploring opportunities for sequestration. Another thing that we don't know is whether carbon taxes will be introduced towards the end of the decade, and that would, if they were, that would provide a significant additional incentive for reducing emissions or developing ways to sequester carbon. But it's something that we will continue to investigate and explore whilst cutting emissions as much as possible.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I've actually got some questions, but I think you might have answered them, but you may have things that you need to add to it. But my first one was, who applies for the grants for K2? And I think you said it was us, but can they also apply for, or is it just done through the council? And the other one was, how else are we encouraging K2 to cut their emissions? Are we like cutting down on paper, cutting down on, I don't know what they're cutting down on, but what they can cut down on that's different from the gas? That's kind of one question, really.
Yeah, thank you. The specific funding stream we're talking about is the public sector decarbonisation scheme, so it's only local authorities who can apply for that. Right. But we're working very closely with EA and to really to work, working very closely with them. We've just been successful in a grant to Sports England, which will help to cover the cost of investment in low energy lighting. So that will also help to reduce their emissions. It's actually still a very efficient building. It's a very good quality building, and we will be through the feasibility study, which is taking place in the next couple of months. We'll be looking to see first of all how can we reduce reliance on gas, but also what changes to the fabric of the building might be needed to improve efficiency and to reduce the need for additional heat. So it's very much an ongoing process, looking for opportunities to make small improvements whilst also working towards the electrification question.
I've got one more question. Are we encouraging the new tenants to this building to be as efficient as we are? And how are we doing that?
Probably the biggest impact we've had is in putting up a building that is considered excellent. So it's a very high quality building with very good insulation. The heating is coming from the district heat network, and we're as part of plans for phase 2 of the district heat network, we're looking at opportunities for the electrification of heat. So if we're able to do that, this building would effectively be off gas. So it would be very low emissions and very, very efficient. So that's probably the biggest thing that we can do to help clients reduce their emissions, and one of the things that's attracting clients to the building.
All committee members have had the opportunity to speak. I move that the Commission is to note the update and request that the views expressed during the presentation and the actions are acknowledged and documented by the officers. I ask the Vice Chair to second, please.
Yes, I'll second that.
Thank you. Right, item 7. We now consider the homeless update report from Ian Duke, Quick Chief Executive. You may remember from last meeting, as a result of the costs being linked to housing and temporary accommodation, the Commission asked for an update report. This report is also not going to Cabinet and is for the Commission only, but Councillor Irvine is also in attendance as the Cabinet member for housing. Please can you kindly introduce the report? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. There's not much for me to say, but I'd like to say actually thank you to the Commission for asking for this report, because homelessness is arguably, at least in the short term, one of the biggest issues facing the Council. And if we didn't discuss it here in public, we wouldn't really have anywhere else to discuss it. Certainly not, I suggest, the Council chamber. So you've had the report. Before I ask you to invite questions, can I just ask for our two officer colleagues to introduce themselves? I know that you probably all know Diana, but just for those who haven't met yet.
Yes, hello, Diana Morn, Head of Strategic Housing. And Helen Davis, the Housing Options Manager within Strategic Housing.
So just some further words of introduction on the paper, and it's not really about the paper, it's what's happened subsequently. So when you look at the report, hopefully there's more detail there than you've seen previously, but you will have seen these themes coming through in the notice of motion and other conversations that we've been having around this issue. There was a big build-up within the sector ahead of the budget, so we were working closely with other councils, the district councils network, on a real cross-party push around the housing benefits subsidy, as you all picked up from the report and from other conversations. That is the government contribution to our meeting our statutory duty around housing, but the amount that we've come in has been frozen since 2011, and there's a broad sector push. In fact, it's now one of the priorities within the district council's network in terms of their lobbying for government. Fortunately, that wasn't successful this time around, but the indications are it's getting more and more traction, and we're seeing kind of conversations of this popping up in other places now. Whereas before, because it's such a technical point, I think it was easy to miss. And it's the biggest single impact that could be made. As a council, we were waiting to see what came out of the budget, to see if what measures would help. There's been some marginal ones, so things like the amount of, or the percentage against a new home we can use right to buy has increased marginally from 40 to 50%. And there's one or two other measures in there, but it's very much on the margins with regard to the agenda here. So the letter that was agreed at council following the housing emergency was sent earlier today. It's gone to a number of departments, and that's recognising that there are a variety of different policy agendas coming into play here. So as well as coming back on the housing benefit subsidy, there has also been asked for consideration about the additional housing pressures coming from asylum contingency dispersal. In the same way, following the same principles, we managed to get agreed in terms of the Chagosy and British Overseas Territories citizenship scheme. And we've also asked for more prominent support in terms of the impact of water neutrality. So we've recognised that South Cambridgeshire, which actually is only in danger of water neutrality, is not in it, has received some significant support from government. And there was a second round of the nutrient neutrality issue, which has some similarities elsewhere in the southeast. Being supported again, but no mention of water neutrality in North Sussex. So there's been an ask to go forward from this. Also, that letter is therefore addressed to DLUC, to the Home Office, to DEFRA, also DWP, because they hold the housing benefit subsidy, the Treasury and Cabinet Office, recognising that this is a cross-departmental issue, and we will see what the response is. And that's all I was going to say by way of update, because the rest of it should be within the report.
Hi. Hello. Yes. This. Thank you for the report. I have read it with great interest, and I am very concerned about the housing situation in Crawley and nationally. We are facing a very, very bleak future when it comes to the housing crisis. I very much supported the housing emergency motion. I think it was the right thing to do, and it's the right thing to take forward as one of our priorities. I was very concerned about the point 4.9 when it mentioned how much the costs really have gone up, and that's a massive percentage, and it really does hit council finances, and the whole temporary housing accommodation and overcrowding situation is just not sustainable for the country. But then I also want to note some other points as well, that I know we've had issues with building and construction due to water neutrality. The planning committee, which I do sit on, has been hampered throughout my entire time on that committee throughout water neutrality, so it does make it hard to build more housing. But then we need to understand that I don't think just building more housing, yes, it would help, but I don't think just building more housing is the answer. We need to take bold and radical policies when it comes to sorting this out, and we have seen a growing demand in Crawley, and this report really does hammer home the bleak situation that we have. So I just want to make those points noted. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We discussed quite few points, I think, in the last council meeting as well about the population growth, and here we are mentioning cost of living crisis and not enough properties available in the private sector. But don't you think the main reason is successive governments, they have failed to build enough social housing? And I don't really see that mentioned or any information on that. What sort of demand is there? How many social housing is built over the years? And what the outlook is for the future? Thank you.
If I could just respond to Councillor Khan and Councillor Ashraf. So I'll hold my brain sometimes. Good points, as you would expect. I agree with Councillor Khan about the costs rising, and we're doing as much as we can to mitigate those costs. For example, we've just opened up our hostel in Ifield Road. We're keeping a tight eye on costs within homelessness and so on and so forth. Personally, I think that building more homes is actually very important, and I think it's true that successive governments haven't built enough homes for social rent. But I would have to say, I looked into this, and in the years of the Blair government, there were very, very few council houses built, but there were, in those years, I think something like 600,000 housing association homes built. Now, I know that's not to everyone's cup of tea, but it's still kind of homes for people who can't afford to buy it out in the open market, so it's social rented. But I think, there is a lot more that needs to be done on that, because homelessness is not just, and it doesn't just have an impact on the people who are homeless. Although that impact, I can't imagine what it's like. I read in the paper the other day that there's a family in this country that have been housed, quotation marks, temporarily for the past 22 years. If that's temporary housing, then what is permanent housing? So But also, of course, as Councillor Carr rightly points out, the cost of it does have an impact on the council and all the other services. And I personally use and enjoy the services that Crawley Borough Council provides, and so do an awful lot of other people. And I wouldn't want to see anything jeopardise that.
So probably safer for me not to comment on what's gone before, but I think if we look at what we've done as a borough over the last 10 years, we've built 1,600 affordable and social housing. So we've got really good record. The rates have dropped off on the back of water neutrality whilst we found solutions. There is a pipeline of properties coming through, but we now get that lag, which is the worst possible time, but couldn't have been avoided. It wasn't a planning issue. So, or it was a planning issue actually, but in terms of our planning. We kind of recognise that long term that the supply of housing is key, but there needs to be in the shorter term other solutions that need to be brought forward, and there's active conversations happening across fellow local authorities about what that might entail in order to give us some other options, but there's no easy or quick fix.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing this sort of my request with the support of the rest of the OSC to put this report forward, and I'm very grateful and thankful for this report. It's really just highlight all the different factors in one place that have got us into the situation we're now in. I guess my first question is around sort of what we're budgeting for next year, you know, how we're looking going forward, because the budget projection or the budget for in 4.9 suggests actually that it might not be as bad money-wise in next year, budget-wise, than it is this year. But then if you look at the graphs on page 18, there doesn't seem to be a let-up in the increase in TA and nightly paid TA. So I just wonder why we think it's going to cost us less next year than it has these last few years. Maybe it's because we're getting, you know, with the hotels dispersing, there's actually the cost of temporary accommodation might have gone down. I don't know. I'm just wondering on that. Secondly, when it comes to water neutrality, I know we've talked about the local plan having a water neutrality strategy. I'm just intrigued to know, obviously I'm not necessarily fully cognizant of the local plan's ins and outs. Will there be, you know, where we as a council make savings for water neutrality or make savings in our water, make our water more neutral, will some of that be offered to sort of private developers that might have schemes ready to go, and whereas we might have capital issues that mean a scheme that we would want to develop, we might struggle to develop as long. So I'm just intrigued to see how we're splitting out that, how the water credits in effect that we get, what the plan is to use them, as I'm sure the water neutrality strategy in the local plan does detail, but I've forgotten it off the top of my head. And I forgot my other question for now, but I'll come back to it if necessary.
So on the budget, I think while we do set a lower budget, we also set out the risk just below it if it's not met. So I mean, that's come about recognising some of the work that's going on around trying to reduce the marginal cost of new accommodation going in. That is getting into discussions with owners of those, block booking. We're also seeing kind of trends within those marginal costs that we've been able to exploit recently, maybe a bit better, and looking at acquisitions and various other things that we've got coming online. So it's one of those things. I guess that we can see what's coming forward, but what we can't see is how that graph is going to change, and given some of the risk factors that we also talk about, it's a very, very difficult one to predict. So you know, we've done our best, but there's a wide margin of error there, and it's probably upwards and not downwards, if I'm being frank. So that's that. On the water neutrality, so what the water neutrality strategy gives us is mechanisms for getting past that. It doesn't really stipulate what water, but that credits derived should be spent on. There is work going on in the background about how you prioritise. I think at the moment we have the retrofitting that we've done on the Crawley Homes property has taken place within the HRA, so it's Crawley Homes that's paid for it, and therefore it sits behind a financial firewall to a degree. That has been done specifically to provide a way of taking forward affordable housing development, and for that purpose, and that's the justification for doing it. I think beyond that, there's a judgment call to be made depending on what comes forward and how that works. But this is all very new territory. But I think it's important to know about, what the driver for that was, how it was funded, and kind of what its primary purpose is. But I don't think it necessarily needs to be exclusive.
It's just regarding the work we've done with other local councils to try and get responses from central government. Obviously, we've had what is horribly called possibly the last fiscal event of this current government, of this parliament. Do we think, and I'm just going to use 2015 as an example, in the 2017 election, teachers banded together to try and put forward a very strong, sort of independent of any political party, a campaign to try and improve the funding for education. And I was certainly very aware of that campaign, and I think other people were at the time as well. Do you think there's an argument, and would district councils and sort of the local councils associated with it, would it be in our interest to actually sort of start trying to actively rather than sort of campaigning in the background, which this one might well have been argued to be campaigning in the background and trying to make the case sort of behind closed doors? Do you think councils should be making a bit more of a public statement of, if you don't start funding this better, then you're not going to have any parks or something along those lines? Yeah, I don't know quite what, I'm not coming up with the campaign on the spot, but do we think that local councils and the networks established should actually be a bit more public and direct and make it a campaign issue at the general election? This might be aimed more at the cabinet member rather than the chief exec, because it's probably a political campaigning question rather than a sort of paid service question.
Well, thanks for your question. I think roughly it was, should we be campaigning more openly about this? Well, I would certainly agree with that, but I'm the cabinet member for housing. I think, I have to say the whole driver behind the housing emergency declaration was our leader, Councillor Jones, and all kudos to him for that. So I think the idea of ramping it up a bit would really be a question for Councillor Jones, but I would happily support that. One of the things that does strike me is that there are 3 councils in Scotland, Glasgow, Edinburgh and Argyll and Bute, all of whom have declared a housing emergency, but unfortunately we can't really ally ourselves with them because they're calling on their own Scottish government for assistance rather than the government of this country as a whole. But I definitely think that there is room for highlighting this issue and for bringing it home to people exactly what the consequences of not addressing this could be.
I do want to come back on a few points, which I remember from last time. 4.5 of this report really lays out how bleak the situation is, and we have almost 500 households in temporary accommodation, and we have over 2,000 people on the housing waiting list, and that has really risen since 2018-2019, and I don't think central governments over the past 20 years of all political persuasion have actually done enough to address this issue, and it is something that will be a massive issue when it comes to the next election, because like people from my generation and people leaving university, leaving education for the first time, trying to figure out what their housing situation are going to be. is completely bleak. And I think when it comes to addressing the lack of social housing, which is one of the massive causes of this situation, was the fact that right to buy is a policy that exists, and it's a policy that has been a disaster for this country and has been a disaster for local authorities as a whole. And I think if that's a campaign that wants to be led on to us by Councillor Jones or any other councillor, I'm more than happy to support that. And there are definitely so much that can be said about the housing crisis, but the figures that are laid out on 4.5 is very bleak, and it just makes for a situation that really needs urgent action.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just really wanted to ask that in the numbers that we're actually in the projections that we're putting forward, what is the population growth of Crawley, and what do we estimate it to be? Because we're looking at obviously the impact that this will have on us in terms of homelessness. Do we have those numbers anywhere that we can actually see for sure what impact that's actually gonna have? Because if we want to, you know, with Gatwick expansion in the background and everything, and we want to attract people to this area, it could put further pressure that we haven't foreseen onto housing and homelessness, potentially.
So, I mean, population growth has been a factor within Crawley. You can see that through the census. So I think in the last 10 years we went up about, no, I'm not going to say a figure because I'm not 100% sure. I've got a figure in mind, but that has been met with a lot of housing growth. I don't have a figure for you, but within the local plan, there was a figure set out within the local plan in terms of our housing needs within the next 15 years. There is we can't meet all of our own housing needs because of land supply issues. So through the local plan, there's been work with neighbouring authorities around duties to cooperate in order to meet that wider housing need. So yeah, housing pressure is a problem, and it's not able to keep up with demand that's coming in. I think the local plan sets that out.
Thank you, Chair. I think one of the most decisive factors has been the local housing allowance and the freezing of that for a phenomenally long period of time, although the autumn statement did announce an unfreezing of it. But it'll take a little while for that to positively impact the private rented sector. In terms of right to buy, in recent years, that's for us not had a great deal of impact. I think the number of right to buy sales is really quite low. I don't have a figure in my head, but I think it's a trickle compared to what it has been. I would make the point that in its history, right to buy has been taken up by many thousands of citizens across the country, and I emphasise regardless of their political persuasion. People have taken that up. But the local government association, on a cross-party basis, I believe, and I don't think it's mentioned in this report, is campaigning for a degree of local determination in the application of the right to buy policy, which is something that I would support. So you do have a degree of local discretion rather than it be a blanket national policy. So I think that's something we should support and suggest that the Cabinet supports. And finally, on population growth, clearly that is a factor, and part of that population growth is due clearly to international obligations that we have as well, and no one's going to argue that we shouldn't meet them. But it must be a factor along with the decline of the private rented sector. And I think the report is right to point out that for our part in Crawley, within the constraints that we've had, we've got a strong delivery track record of council homes and indeed the housing association delivery as well. I mean, the figures speak for themselves, and I think we restarted the delivery of council homes around 2008, in fact, in Langley Green. So it's good to see that that initiative has been followed by more. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that actually Councillor Lanza's right about the right to buys being at a minimum. I think last year we saw four or five homes through right to buy, whereas at one point in 1988, I think we were selling council homes at the rate of 100 a week, and that was, you know, homes were being built, and a few years later, they were being sold. And I don't think that was even covering the costs of building the home in the first place. There's certainly, I mean, you know, whatever you can say about right to buy, don't forget Scotland has abolished it, and I believe Wales has abolished it. It certainly has had an impact on the housing situation in this country. But anyway, I'll take your point about how we've done quite well out of building council homes, and thank you for that. I mean, ultimately, I don't think there's any quick fix to any of this. We just have to keep on doing what we're doing, which is building homes when we can, opening hostels when we can, and don't forget, at one point in the 1980s and 1990s, cruelly did grow. It grew in Ifield and it grew in Modenbauer. We didn't particularly in the 2000s have much of a homeless problem, and I distinctly remember at the end of that decade, in about 2008, 2009, the council was actually decommissioning some of its homeless hostels. Gosh, I wish we still had them now.
Right, thank you for presenting the report. All the committee members have had the opportunity to speak. I move that the Commission is asked to note the update and request that reviews expressed during the presentation and any actions are acknowledged and documented by the officers, please. I ask the Vice Chair to second the report.
Yes, I second that.
And the recommendations are agreed. Agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Right, item 8 is the HASC report from Councillor Khan.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi. Yes, I will be delivering the HASC report. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible, but I do have a few points I want to raise. Yes, the HASC meeting was last week, which I did attend virtually, and so let's start with what I have to say. So the first points I want to make are on the South East Coast Ambulance Service update. So this was item 5 that was discussed. So nationally, ambulance services have remained in a challenged position throughout 2023, which has now transitioned into 2024. And despite these pressures, and following the national focus on NHS England on response times, the Trust Committee report remains positive and on track to hit the 30 minutes mean target for the year. Overall, the Trust has improved response times, which, when compared to August-September 2023, and the Trust positioning when benchmarked against ambulance services across England. So that's a bit of some positive news. Emergency call answering has also been a significant challenge for the Trust for September 2023. The call answer time was 47 seconds against a target of 5 seconds. So this has obviously been a very very highlighted situation which they are looking to improve, and the Trust's 111 service has had a mixed performance with call and answering and call abandonment rates proving to be a challenge, while ambulance deposition, vandalism and direct referral on services do remain positive. So those are the main items for that one. So just and then the next ones, and then the next point which I want to raise, is the item was on item 7 on the update on the delivery of the 2-year program to assist the delivery of adult social care of the adult social care strategy and the preparation of the Care Quality Commission. So just a bit of background of this. In 2023, the Scrutiny Committee considered a report set out in detail for the first iteration of the social care self-assessment in preparation for the Care Quality Commission, and then set out in the previous report. The programme is being delivered during a period of significant challenges, which include the need to support our NHS partners in their facilitation and discharging patients of hospitals. So the key lines of inquiry for this include the progress made to date of the improvement plan, the linkage with the content of the updated iteration of the care self-assessment plan, and how the committee intends to discharge this scrutiny responsibility. So that's that one, and then the last important point, which I think it's due to, which I think is worth recognising, is the adult services portfolio and the performance summary, and this will be the last points that I cover. So work has continued this quarter to drive forward the 2-year adult social care improvement programme, which commenced in April 2023, and this work has been ongoing, and the programme is split into work streams which include strategic commissioning, practice and operations finance. So this is still ongoing and this looks positive. So I will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Councillor Khan. Does anyone have any questions for her? No? Right, item 9 is
Okay, thank you, Chair. Just to obviously mention, this is the last OSC meeting of the municipal year, and it's just to make councillors aware that obviously the forthcoming decision list has all those reports listed for next year. So I would remind everyone just to keep an eye on that forthcoming decision list. It's available on the intranet and the website. Also, all councillors will receive the usual email when a forthcoming decision notice is published. So if there are any items to be referred, please can Democratic Services be informed ASAP. That being said, just moving on to next year, just so everyone is aware, at present there are 2 finance reports and the local plan report heading to Cabinet, and also OSC for the late June meetings. I do expect there'll be more to follow, given we're only in March, but at the moment there's only 3 reports heading to the late June meeting. Thank you.